Hi, welcome to Cheer Pop Studio. I'd like to talk about a recipe I adapted for paper mache clay from ultimatepapermache.com. I thought it was a wonderful recipe from a website with a wealth of information, but I had different uses for the clay than what it seemed like other visitors to the site had, making decorative bowls, so I altered it a bit. There was enough of a difference between the recipes that I thought some explanation might be helpful. So why would I change such a good recipe? First of all, recycling is important to me. My main reason for getting into paper making was to recycle household scrap paper. The original recipe calls for toilet paper, which hopefully isn't being recycled. The second reason is that sometimes I want the option of the texture of handmade paper rather than the finer texture that toilet paper makes. Another reason is that when I tried to form a bowl originally, the clay was a little too wet for me, so I changed the quantity of the paper for a firmer batch. Finally, Johnny Good uses some kitchen equipment like a hand mixer, and I didn't want to use my food making tools for mixing paper, joint compound, and glue. And I have this fabulous paint mixer that attaches to a drill. It's one of my favorite tools, so I was looking for any excuse to use it in the paper making process. It makes going from scrap to pulp a lot easier. So, what tools and supplies do you need while you're doing this process? You need a large bucket, both to beat the paper pulp and to mix up the final clay material. You also need a tool to beat the paper to a pulp with. You could use a paint mixer that attaches to a drill like my fabulous mixer. This one was about $4 at Harbor Freight, and I can also use it for home improvement projects. Or you could try a dedicated hand mixer from a yard sale, secondhand store, or Craigslist. It might be a bit tough on the motor and blades though, since scrap paper doesn't fall apart quite as easily as toilet paper. You'll also need a tarp or other waterproof covering. This process gets very spattery. The material I ended up using comes from chicken feed bags. When one was empty, I noticed that it looked like the same material as a tarp you'd use outside, so I found a second life for them. Always makes me happy. You'll also need measuring cups and spoons, a strainer or colander of any kind. The finer the mesh, the better. It's very helpful if you have something like coffee filters. Even better if you put a piece of window screen between the strainer and the filters. When you strain the paper pulp, the filters help keep some of the slurry from ending up in your drain. Last but not least, an airtight storage container for the pulp if you don't make the clay right away. That's all you need for supplies. Now let's talk about ingredients. So what's different about the new recipe? I've mentioned that I changed the type of paper in the recipe, but I also doubled the amount of paper I used so that I'd have a firmer clay. The type of oil is slightly different too. Instead of using 1 1/4 cups of wet toilet paper, I used 2 1/2 cups of wet scrap paper pulp. To make the paper pulp, you start out with scrap paper that you have around the house. I save junk mail, the endless to-do lists I create, page-a-day Sudoku calendars, envelopes, you name it. Anything that comes your way that isn't really glossy like most magazines, or isn't heavyweight like cardboard, although egg cartons will break down really easily since they're just dried paper pulp anyway. That leaves a lot of options for what you can recycle. It doesn't matter what color paper you use unless it's tissue paper or some gift wraps which will color the pulp. But generally, if you put in multicolors and think that's what you'll get, instead you'll just get a nice, boring, uniform gray because of the inks. As you collect the paper, just tear it into pieces that are about 1 inch square or smaller. I keep a grocery store bag hanging near the kitchen, tear it as I go along, then when I need it I've got a nice bag full. The next item on the list is joint compound, pre-mixed, not dry, and this is the same as in the original recipe. You'll need Elmer's or some other PVA glue. After that, the cheapest flour you can find. I think I paid $1.87 for this. I save the good stuff for baking bread, where I can taste it. And then baby oil, which is also different from the original recipe. I didn't have any linseed or mineral oil, and I know that baby oil is similar to mineral oil, so I substituted it. As a bonus, this smells really good when you're working with the wet clay and when you sand the dried piece. It isn't very noticeable otherwise, but it makes the whole bowl making process just that much nicer. Okay, now we're ready to make the paper pulp. I've dumped about 1/3 to 1/2 of grocery bags worth of torn paper scraps into a large bucket with a lot of water and let it soak overnight. Soaking softens it up and helps the fibers break apart more readily. It's also easier on your tools and cuts down on the time you'll need to beat it to a pulp. You can get away with soaking for a couple of hours, but the longer you leave it, the less time and work for you. Here it is, already soaked. The extra water helps so the motor of the drill isn't working too hard, and there's plenty of room to splash around. You might want to pull up a chair for this part because you'll be here for several minutes. Might as well be comfortable. I've got my handy dandy paint mixer that I like so much, and then I just rev this baby up. So it's like you're making a big, papery, disgusting tasting dough. The longer you beat the pulp, the finer the clay will be. You'll have fewer lumps when you're trying to spread the clay, and it'll be easier to sand the dried piece. So take your time, think of it as a meditation practice, and you'll have a nice smooth clay. I've beaten it for about another 5 minutes, and I'd say just beat it until you can't stand it anymore. Every once in a while, it's a good idea to clean the pulp from the mixer. It tends to collect bigger pieces in the blades, which aren't sharp, by the way. But safety first, if you hold the mixer by the stem, I don't know what else to call it, then the drill won't accidentally start up. You may have noticed there were a lot of different colors of paper at first. I saw light blue, green, yellow. Now it's all one uniform gray, oatmeal-y mess. I'll stop here, and this is what we'll use for the clay. It'll get beaten even more in the next part of the process. You can see how the big bucket gives you plenty of room to mix. If you can find something this big, great. If not, you can make it in a smaller bucket, but you might want to wear more protective covering. Now that we've gotten to the point where the paper pulp is mixed, it's time to strain the excess water out so it'll work in the recipe. I've got a strainer that's been fitted out with some coffee filters. I use 2 because they tend to be a little weak, and this is very wet, so when you pick it up they could break. And this will also help you get it into the storage container. I'll move the bucket right into the sink and scoop out a whole bunch. It's nice and gushy. Drop it right in there. I like the way it feels. This is why you use the coffee filters. The slurry is so soft and fuzzy, and that would end up down the drain. I've also got a wire mesh strainer in the sink so that as this drips, if I lose any, I can collect that later and dump it. I've got quite a bit. This recipe makes a good amount. Now I'll pick up the paper and try to get the majority of the excess water out. I'm giving it a little bit of a squeeze, not too hard. I want it to hold together, but not be so dry that it's very hard or crumbles apart in chunks. It just needs to form a ball, hold itself together. I can pat it around. Now I've got a ball. Then I can put it into the storage container, and this lasts a fairly long time inside the container. If you feel like you need to leave it for more than a few days, put a little bleach in it, and my feeling is if it still smells like a swimming pool, I'm good to go. So you can see there are still some pieces of color in here, but that's just because they didn't get beaten well enough. I saw a big piece of paper in here, so I'm tossing that. For pieces that haven't been beaten enough into nice little pulpy pieces, just pull them out and put them aside. You can use them in your next batch. This recipe will probably fill up that container. If I have more than one lying around, I write the date on the top so I know how long it's been around and which one to use first. Here's the finished product, and luckily it came just to the top of this container. You may notice that there are some pockets of water in here, so what I'll do is turn it upside down and squeeze a little to drain the excess. You want it to be wet but not dripping, and you do have a chance to squeeze more out if you need to when you're making the clay. At this point, if you've had enough for today and you want to put it away, just close it up in the airtight container. But it's ready, and I'm planning to use some right away.